Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to quickly and easily set up authentication on your web app using Google Firebase. We're going to build a message board application. You'll be able to sign up and sign in securely with either email and password or with your Google account. After you're done with this video, you'll be able to implement Firebase authentication on any of your applications, including web and mobile. So why Firebase? Firebase is a platform by Google that helps developers build and manage mobile and web apps easily by providing tools like authentication, databases, cloud functions, and web hosting. It can be used with a separate backend, but it's particularly useful for building apps with serverless architecture. Firebase is relatively simple to set up and implement. It's secure, and there's also a generous free tier option. The first thing we need to do is set up our development environment. This is going to be a single page application using vanilla JavaScript, but I'm still going to create the project using Vite. We could just create the project from scratch, but we'll be installing and importing libraries. And in order for these imports to work, we would also have to install and configure a bundler like Webpack, which adds a little bit of complexity to the project. Vite handles all of this for us while keeping the structure of the project relatively simple. In order to use Vite, you'll have to have Node installed on your machine. If you don't have it already, just go to nodejs.org and download the most recent version with long-term support. I'll open up a terminal in my VS Code and just quickly check that Node is installed. I'll also have to install Vite, which I can do with npm. And now I can create a project with npx create Vite at latest, and then the name of the project. In this case, it's going to be Firebase tutorial. I'm going to select vanilla framework and then select JavaScript. Once that's done, I'll change into my Firebase tutorial directory, npm install to install the dependencies, and then npm run dev to launch the app. I can see here it's on localhost. I can see the Vite sample page here, which shows that it works, but we don't want this page. We just want a blank website. I'm just going to go through here and delete some of these files. We don't need counter. I can take out any of the HTML in the body, delete everything in the JavaScript file, main.js, and then also delete everything in the CSS file. Now I can go back to the website. I can see it's completely blank and we're ready to get to work. The next thing we have to do is create the app to authenticate on. I've gone ahead and added all the HTML and CSS to the file. The form is set to log in with either email, password, or a Google account, as well as signing up. There's just a few things that we need to look at in the HTML here to understand how the authentication works. This is a single page application and it's divided into two main sections. Here we have the section ID logged out view. So this is the view that we see when we're not logged in. This contains all of the forms for logging in or signing up, which we see here. When the user actually logs in, they're going to see this section, which is the logged in view. So this contains the code for the actual app, which is a message board in this case. And the way we're handling authentication is by toggling the logged out view and the logged in view with CSS. When a user goes to the app and they're not logged in, the logged out view section will have display set to block so we can see it. And the logged in view will have display set to none. But if we were to switch these and set logged out view to none and logged in view to block, then we would see our message board as a logged in viewer. So this is how authentication is going to be handled, is by toggling the display for the IDs of these two sections. Now, I'll admit this is not the most beautifully designed message board you've ever seen, but this is a tutorial on Firebase, not on UI, so this will do for our purposes. The last thing I want to show you in this code is the JavaScript. I set up variables here to target the inputs in the login and sign up form, and to target the buttons for logging in, signing up, and logging out. I also created event listeners for all the buttons when they're clicked. Right now we just have some console log information so that we can test that it's all working. So if I go back to the login page and just open up my console, I can run a couple of tests just to make sure that it's working. And when we click, we can see we're getting those console logs and we're able to get the information in the forms. Also click sign in with Google. We can see sign in with Google. So this is all set up in the JavaScript so that we can target these elements and then also run code when the buttons are clicked. I'll make all this code available on GitHub and there'll be a link in the description below. Now we're ready to start setting up the authentication on Firebase. The first thing you'll have to do is set up a Firebase account if you don't have one already. Just go to firebase.google.com and click Get Started. I already have an account, so I'm going to go to my console. We need to add a project and we'll give it a name. I'll call this project Message App. Click Continue. We're not going to enable Google Analytics for this project. Then click Create Project. This will just take a couple seconds. When the project is ready, we'll click Continue, and we're sent to the project console. Now we want to create an app by clicking on this icon here. We're going to create a web app. I'm going to give it the same name, Message App, but you can name it something different. We're not going to set up Firebase hosting, and now I'm going to click Register App. Now that the app is registered, we can add the Firebase SDK. First, we're going to install Firebase. I'll go back to my VS Code, open a terminal, and then npm install Firebase. Once that's done, I'll go back to the Firebase console. And this is the code that we use to connect to our application and initialize it on Firebase. I'll copy this code, go back to VS Code, and I want to go to my main.js file, and I'm just going to paste this code up at the top. So here we're importing initialize app from the Firebase SDK. This is all the configuration data, including the API key and all the data that's needed to connect to our application on Firebase. And here we're initializing Firebase for our application. Now, one thing I want to point out that some people might notice is that the API key is sitting here right in our JavaScript. Because this is being sent to the client, this is information that would be accessible by the user. Normally, this is a big stop no. You do not send the API key to the client. This is information that is supposed to be secret. Typically, if somebody has your API key, they're able to access different services. So you don't want to do that in almost all cases. But Firebase operates a little bit differently. With Firebase, this API key is supposed to be available to the client. And the reason why that's okay is because you can't do much with just the API key alone. The way Firebase manages security is through something called security rules. And we'll talk in depth about security rules when we actually set up a Firestore database. But just for now, understand that it's okay for the API key to be included in this JavaScript and not hidden. Now that we have the project set up and the app initialized, we're ready to implement the authentication. I'm going to go to the console for my Message App project. Then I'm going to go to Build and click Authentication. Inside the authentication window, I'm going to click Get Started. One of the great things about Firebase is that it provides these different login methods. So you can use email password, you can use your phone number, and several third-party providers like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. We're going to start with just implementing email and password. Click Email Password, and then just click Enable and Save. Now that this is done, we're going to go to the documentation. Go to firebase.google.com/docs. Go to the Build drop-down menu and click Authentication. Inside the authentication options, we're going to select Web and then Password Authentication. The code that you need to create a new account with an email and password is right here. The first thing I'm going to do is copy this import statement. Then I'm going to go back to my main.js file and paste it here. Then we need to create an instance of the authentication service. I'll paste that line of code here. Finally, this is the code we need to actually create the user account. Going back to main.js, I set up this event listener here so that when a user clicks the Create Account button, it'll execute this code. So I'm going to put my Create User with Email and Password function in here, and we can see if it executes successfully, then it's going to create this user object. I'll console log this, and then I'll also console log any error message. And then the actual values for email and password can be extracted from this variable email signup form and password signup form, which we created up here. I'll just copy and paste these. And that should work. Next, we're going to scroll down here to this code so that we can sign in with email and password. I'm going to add this function to the imports. We've already created this authentication instance. And now I'm going to copy this code and I'm going to place it in the event listener for the login button. Just as before, I'll console log the user and any error message. And then I'll replace email and password with the values that we're getting from the email sign-in form and the password sign-in form. And now I'll test it in the app. I'll open up my console. And I'll start by signing up with a test email. Click Create Account. And we can see that it is console logged our user object. So there's information in here like the email, there's an access token, and other information as well. To confirm that this worked, I'll go back to my authentication page. And I can see right here under users that it created that account, test@gmail. So the great thing about using Firebase for authentication is that it handles all of the security and the password storage. We don't have to be responsible for encrypting or storing or handling the passwords. Google basically does all of that. So we don't even have access to the passwords. That takes a lot of load off the developer to not have to worry about password security. Now let's test the login. And again, this appears to work because we're seeing our user object here. Now, what would happen if I tried to log in with an email that didn't exist? Try and sign in, and we can see we're getting an error. And the error is invalid credential because we're trying to log in with a password that has not been signed up or does not exist in the system. So all of this seems to work. Next, we're going to set up the Google authentication. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my authentication window. I'm going to click Sign In Method and Add New Provider. So again, these are all the different sign-in methods we could use. I'll click Google, Enable, and then I just have to give it a support email. Save. One other thing you may have to do is authorize domains to be able to use the sign-in. So to do that, click Settings, scroll down to Authorize Domains, and here you can add any domains that are hosting your website that you're authenticating through. So localhost, which is what I'm using right now, is there by default, so I don't need to add anything. But for example, if you were hosting on a different platform, you'd want to have your domain name in here so that you could actually authenticate on your app. With that done, we're going to go back to the documentation. We're going to go down here and click Google, and then scroll down to the code here for Google sign-in. First of all, we have to add this import, Google Auth Provider. I'll add that to our main.js file. Then we have to create an instance of the Google Auth Provider. I'll add that here. Then we need to scroll down the page. And then finally, we need to add one more import, which is sign in with pop-up. This is the code that we're going to need. I'll copy it. Now I'll go to my event listener for Google sign-in and just copy that code into here. And again, I'll log some of this data. With Google Authentication, there's no difference between sign in and sign up. So I could just repeat all of this code down here for the sign up button. But instead of that, what I'll do is I'll create an array for these buttons. And then I'll loop through this array and apply the event listener to each button. That way we won't need to double up on the code. Now I can go back to the app and test out the Google sign up. And we can see that this does sign me in and creates a user object. I'll confirm again in my authentication window, and we can see here that it did in fact sign me up, and it specifies that the provider is Google. Now I'm just going to test the login, and again, it creates the user object, so this does appear to work. We're now at the final step, which is logging in and logging out of the website. I'm going to go back to the documentation, and I'm going to click this button here, Manage Users. We've already set up the login authentication. So when we log in, it creates a user object. But the way we're actually going to log in and log out of the site is by using this function here, on-auth state changed. So what this is going to do is this is going to detect if there's a change in whether or not the user is logged in or logged out. And if there is a change, then we can implement some logic. I'm going to add this library to the imports. Then I'm going to copy this function, on-auth state changed. And I'm just going to put that here above our event listeners. So what this is going to do is this is going to detect a change in whether or not the user is logged in or logged out, so a state change. So if the user logs in with one of these functions that we've already added, then we'll be able to run some logic. We'll be able to see if there is a user object, which means that they're logged in, and then we'll make whatever changes on the site we need. Otherwise, if there's no user logic, that means that we have logged out, and we'll make whatever changes need to be made. Just a reminder, if I go back to the HTML, this site is basically divided into two sections. There's the logged out view. So this contains all of our login and sign up forms, and this is what you see when you're not logged in. And then there's the logged in view, which contains the HTML for the message board. And the way we're handling what the user can view on the site is by toggling the IDs for these two sections. So by default, logged out view is set to block, so it's visible. Logged in view is set to none. When we're logged in, we're going to switch this around so we'll be able to see the message board. I'll just have to create a couple of variables up here so I can target those sections by ID. And now I can go to my on-auth changed function. So what I want to do is make sure that I set my logged in view .style.display to equal block. And then my logged out view to equal none. And if there is no user object available, then that means I'm signed out. And I want to reverse these and set logged in view to none and logged out view to block. And then I'm also going to want to be able to log out. So I'm going to go back to the documentation, go back to password authentication, and then scroll down to the logout function, which is sign out. So I'll just copy and paste the import, and then I'll copy and paste the code where I created an event listener for my logout button. Now I'll save. And there's just one more thing that I want to do to test this. Here in my logged in view, I have this text, you are logged in as Aaron. I'm actually going to replace this with a span of ID user email. Then I'll go back to my JavaScript main.js and I'll create a variable user email that targets that element. And that way, when I log in, I can display the email. Okay, I'll save this and let's see if it works. I'm on the login screen. I'll try logging in with my Google account. And it works. And we can see you are logged in and there's my email. I can test the logout button. It logs me out. Now I'll try logging in with my test email. And it works. You can see you are logged in as test@gmail. So this is complete. We've done the full authentication. We can log in, we can log out, we can sign up with either email, password, or Google. Having that easy implementation of Google login and sign up is great because most users don't want to have to worry about other passwords. So it just makes it simple. And now with the authentication and the authorization set up, you can work on actually building an application. So right now, these posts are just hard-coded into the application. But the next stage is we actually want to connect this app to a Firestore database so that we can create posts, save them, and then view posts. And that's what we're going to look at in the next video. So we're done for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this content useful, then please hit the like button or subscribe to the channel. I'll be coming out with a lot more tutorials and a lot more information on Firebase. Also post a comment. I'm happy to reply to any questions anybody has. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.